The tent was white, the flowers were white, and the man standing at the podium with his hand resting on a brass plaque was telling a room full of strangers that my husband had never really been part of this family. Caleb made his choice, Preston Kensington said, smiling at the crowd, like he was doing them a favor. We loved him, of course. But he chose a different life. This plaque should reflect the family he actually stayed close to. Behind him, a work crew waited beside a rolling cart, a small grinding tool already plugged in, ready to sand my husband's name off a bronze plate that had hung in that hotel lobby for 6 years. My daughter's hand tightened around mine. She was 3. She didn't understand what was happening, only that my whole body had gone rigid, and children always know when a room turns dangerous, even if they can't say why. I opened my mouth to speak, and nothing came out. Every rehearsed sentence I'd built in the car on the drive over evaporated the second I saw that grinder. That's when the doors at the back of the ballroom opened, and 2 figures in dress uniforms I hadn't expected to see for another 2 months walked in like they owned the building, boots silent on the marble, faces set in the particular calm that only comes from people who have delivered bad news to worse people before. The taller one, silver eagle on his collar, looked at the grinder, looked at Preston, and said only this, in a voice that didn't need to be raised to fill the room. "Turn that thing off. You're about to erase a Silver Star recipient, and I have paperwork that says you can't." ACT-1. Backstory. My name is Naomi Ellison. I'm a captain in the United States Army, currently assigned to the Military Police Corps at Fort Stewart, Georgia. I've worn this uniform for 9 years, and in that time I have written more casualty reports, stood more color guards, and delivered more bad news to more families than I ever imagined the day I signed my name at a recruiting station in Savannah at 22 years old. Nothing in that career prepared me for burying my own husband, and nothing prepared me for watching his family try to pretend he never existed at all. I met Caleb Grayson in the spring of 2019, during a joint training exercise at Fort Benning. He was a ranger, assigned to support the same range rotation I was working, and he had a way of being quiet that made you lean in closer, instead of tuning him out. He wasn't the loudest man in any room. He was the one you noticed was watching everything, missing nothing, and only speaking when it mattered. He had scarred knuckles from a boxing habit he never bragged about, and a habit of holding doors a half-second too long, like he needed to be sure you actually made it through before he let go. For the first few months, he didn't talk much about his family, and I didn't push. Some people carry their history like a backpack they'd rather not open in front of new faces. I remember one evening, sitting on the tailgate of a truck after a long-range day, asking him a simple question about where he grew up, and watching his whole face shift before he answered, like he was deciding how much of the real story to hand me. When he finally told me, it came out slowly, almost apologetically, like he expected me to think less of him for it. His father died in a car accident when Caleb was 11. It was sudden, and it left a hole in the family that his mother, Diane, tried to fill a few years later by marrying a man named Richard Kensington, who owned a small but growing chain of boutique hotels along the South Carolina coast. Richard was decent enough to Diane. He wasn't cruel, but he came with a son of his own, Preston, 4 years older than Caleb, and from the beginning it was made quietly, consistently clear that the family business belonged to Preston to inherit and protect, not to Caleb to share. Caleb didn't want the hotels anyway. He wanted something that felt like his own choice for once. When he told his mother and stepfather he had enlisted instead of finishing the hospitality management program Richard had already put a deposit down for, something in that household cracked in a way that never fully healed. It wasn't a dramatic disownment. It was quieter than that, and in its own way worse. Phone calls got shorter. Holiday invitations arrived a week late, or didn't arrive at all. Preston, in particular, never missed a chance to say something like, "Some people serve their country, and some people serve their family," as though those two things had ever been in competition, instead of 2 ways the same man could choose to show up. Caleb never let it turn him bitter, at least not where anyone could see it. He'd shrug it off with a half-smile, and say his mother loved him in her own complicated way, and then change the subject to something lighter before I could push further. He built his real family out of the people who chose to stay close on purpose, his squad, his platoon sergeant, a rotating cast of ranger buddies who showed up for every birthday even when his blood relatives didn't, and eventually, me. We married in the fall of 2021, a small courthouse ceremony in Columbus, Georgia, with two of his squad mates standing in as witnesses because his mother said she couldn't get away that particular weekend. I remember standing on those courthouse steps afterward, laughing about the flowers we'd bought from a gas station because we hadn't planned far enough ahead, and thinking that whatever this family of his lacked, we were going to build something sturdier from scratch. Our daughter Wren was born the following spring. I will never forget the way Caleb held her for the first time, like she was made of something more fragile than glass, his whole enormous frame folding down small and careful around this 6-pound person. He told me that night, and more than once afterward, that whatever happened to him someday, he needed her to grow up knowing exactly who her father was. I used to think that was just something new fathers said in the middle of the night, when the hormones and exhaustion made everyone sentimental. I'd tease him about it sometimes, tell him he was being dramatic, and he'd just shake his head and say some things were worth being dramatic about. I didn't know yet how much those words would come to matter. Caleb deployed twice during our marriage, quiet both times about the details, the way most of them are. He came home from each one with a few new scars, a slightly longer stare into the middle distance some mornings, and the same steady laugh that made our small rented house in Hinesville feel like the safest place on earth. In early 2024, his battalion began preparing for a large joint air assault exercise at a training range in North Carolina. Fast rope insertions from Black Hawk helicopters, night operations, the exact kind of grinding, unglamorous training that exists specifically so that real deployments don't turn into funerals. On a Tuesday night in March, during a night descent, a rigging failure in the rope system sent 2 junior soldiers into a dangerous, uncontrolled fall from a height that should have ended in broken bones at best. I wasn't there, obviously, but I've since heard the account from 3 different soldiers who were, and each version lines up with the last down to the smallest detail. The sudden metallic snap of failing hardware, the shouted warning, the half-second where everyone froze except Caleb. He was the one positioned closest, and in the 2 or 3 seconds he had to make a decision, he physically redirected one soldier's fall path with his own body and absorbed an impact that, by every account I was later given, should have killed him outright. It didn't kill him outright. It put him in an intensive care unit in Fayetteville for 6 days. I was there for 5 of them, sleeping in vinyl chairs, learning the names of every nurse on that floor, watching monitors instead of sleeping. His mother came for one afternoon, stayed 2 hours, and left before dinner. Preston never came at all, though he did send a text asking whether the hospital had a family waiting room with decent Wi-Fi, which I didn't answer. On the 6th day, Caleb Grayson died from complications related to his injuries. He was 31 years old, a husband, a father, and, though almost nobody outside his own unit knew it yet, a soldier whose command had already quietly begun the paperwork to recommend him for the nation's 3rd highest award for valor. That recommendation hadn't been finalized when he died, which meant that to most of the world, including his own mother, Caleb was simply a man who had walked away from a family business and died in what Diane would later describe to relatives, in a tone that made my skin crawl, as a training thing. The funeral itself was small, held at a chapel near Fort Bragg, attended mostly by soldiers in dress uniform, and a scattering of relatives who seemed unsure whether they belonged in the front pews or somewhere further back. Diane sat 3 rows behind me, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, occasionally glancing my way, like she wanted to say something and couldn't find the words. Preston didn't come at all that day either, citing a prior commitment that turned out, months later, to be a golf outing with a hotel investor, a detail I only learned from a cousin who thought I'd want to know, though I wished afterward that she hadn't told me. At the reception, in a rented banquet room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and lilies, Command Sergeant Major Vance found me standing alone near a window and told me, gently, that whatever happened next, Caleb's unit considered me and Wren part of their family now, whether the Kensingtons ever chose to see it that way or not. I held on to that sentence tighter than I expected to at the time, not knowing yet how soon I would need it. I buried my husband that spring, without knowing yet how much of his story his own family was about to try to bury, right alongside him. ACT-2. The incident. The trouble started 9 days after the funeral, when a funeral home coordinator called to ask why a woman identifying herself as Mrs. Kensington had contacted her directly to request a change to the headstone inscription. I didn't understand the question at first. Then it landed, cold and sudden, somewhere behind my ribs, Diane wanted the stone to read simply, "Beloved son," no rank, no unit, no mention that he had been a husband, a father, or anything beyond a child she had once raised. No mention of me at all. I corrected it quickly enough. I was his legal next of kin, and the paperwork sat in my name, not hers. But it was the first small crack in a wall I would spend the next month watching crumble in slow motion. I remember standing in my kitchen that afternoon, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the funeral coordinator read the requested inscription back to me twice, as though she also couldn't quite believe what she was saying out loud. Wren was in her high chair a few feet away, banging a spoon against the tray, completely unaware that somewhere across the state, her own grandmother was trying to edit her father's headstone down to 2 words. I hung up, sat down on the kitchen floor, and let myself cry for exactly 4 minutes before I made myself get up and start dinner, because that's what you do when you're a single parent on a Tuesday, grief or no grief. 3 weeks after that, an invitation arrived. Not to me directly, but forwarded from a distant cousin who apparently felt guilty enough to slip it my way. The Kensington family was hosting a private memorial gathering at their flagship hotel in Charleston, unveiling something they were calling a family remembrance wall in the main lobby. Wren and I weren't on the guest list. Diane's reasoning, relayed to me secondhand through that same cousin, was that the gathering was for family, and that Caleb's army friends and I had already had our service, back at the funeral. I called Diane directly that same evening. She was polite in the specific way people are polite when they've already decided you no longer matter to them. "Naomi, I know you loved him," she said, in a voice that had clearly practiced this sentence before saying it out loud to me. "But you have to understand, Caleb walked away from us a long time ago. This gathering is about honoring the boy we raised, not rewriting old wounds that don't need reopening." I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, what that meant for Wren, his daughter, her own granddaughter. There was a long pause on the line, before she said Wren would be welcome, someday, once things settled down a bit. I remember staring at my daughter's baby monitor on the counter while she said it, watching Wren sleep, and feeling something in me go very quiet and very determined at the same time. Things escalated from there, and faster than I expected. Preston, who had taken over most of the hotel group's day-to-day operations in recent years, apparently decided the remembrance wall required some editing before the unveiling. A distant cousin, the same one who'd forwarded the invitation, sent me a phone photo of the proposed plaque layout. It listed extended family members across 3 generations, with Caleb's entire life reduced to a single line: Caleb Grayson, 1993 to 2024. No mention of the Army anywhere on it. Sandwiched awkwardly between a great-uncle who had once donated a decorative fountain and a distant cousin's wedding announcement from 2 years earlier. Then, 10 days before the scheduled unveiling, a letter arrived from the family's estate attorney. It cited an old life insurance beneficiary form from Caleb's earliest enlistment years, filed long before we had even met, listing his mother as the designated beneficiary on his service member's group life insurance. The letter suggested that, because the form had apparently never been formally updated in the family's own private records, the family believed the full payout should rightfully go to Diane rather than to me. That letter was simply wrong, and I knew it without a doubt, because I had personally watched Caleb sit at our kitchen table and update his SGLI beneficiary designation in writing, in his own handwriting, the week after Wren was born. He'd made a joke about it at the time, something about finally being worth more to me on paper than he was in person, and I'd swatted him with a dish towel and told him not to talk like that in front of the baby. I still had a photograph of that moment on my phone, him grinning over the paperwork, pen in hand, Wren asleep in the bassinet beside him. But that letter told me something more important than a paperwork dispute. This had stopped being about grief entirely. It had become about money, about reputation, and about a family quietly constructing a version of events in which Caleb had never truly left them, and I had never truly existed at all. I called Grace Sullivan that same week, an attorney a fellow Army spouse had recommended after a similar estate dispute of her own, mostly just to understand where I legally stood. Grace read through the letter twice, went quiet for a moment, and told me plainly that whoever had drafted it either didn't understand federal insurance law or was hoping I wouldn't bother to check. In the days leading up to that gathering, I told myself I was going for Wren's sake, so that someday, when she was old enough to ask, I could tell her I had at least tried to keep a door open. I packed her favorite stuffed rabbit in the diaper bag, chose a dress Caleb had once told me he liked, and drove the 2 hours to Charleston rehearsing calm sentences the entire way, the kind I imagined might actually reach Diane if I said them gently enough. None of those sentences survived contact with the room. The moment that finally broke something loose in me came 2 days before the unveiling, at that same smaller family gathering I attended, only because Diane had, at last, extended an invitation to me directly. Preston cornered me near the coat check, in front of 3 relatives standing close enough to hear every word, and said, quietly enough to sound private, and loudly enough to be heard by everyone nearby, "Some women marry soldiers for the benefits. I'm not judging you for it. I just think we shouldn't stand here pretending this was some great love story." I didn't cry in front of him. I didn't raise my voice, though every part of me wanted to. I told him I would see him at the unveiling, turned, and made it all the way to the parking lot before my composure finally gave out against the steering wheel of my car. Before I made that call, I sat on my back porch for nearly an hour, phone in my lap, replaying every version of the last few weeks. I texted a fellow Army spouse, a woman named Renee I'd met through a support group for military widows 2 states away, and told her what Preston had said at the coat check. She didn't try to talk me out of my anger, and she didn't try to smooth it over either. She simply wrote back, "You've been carrying this alone because you didn't want to burden anyone. Stop doing that. Call his unit. They exist for exactly this." I read that message 4 times before I finally picked up the phone. That night, once Ren was asleep, I called the one number I hadn't tried yet, Command Sergeant Major Elena Vance, who had served as Caleb's senior enlisted leader for 3 years, and who had sat beside me in that ICU hallway more times than either of us could count during those 6 days. I told her everything, start to finish, my voice cracking somewhere around the part about the headstone. There was a long silence on the other end of the line when I finished. "Naomi," she said finally, her voice low and steady, in a way that told me she was already moving before she'd even hung up the phone. "There's something about that award recommendation you don't know yet. Don't do a single thing until we get there. Do you understand me? Nothing." Act 3, The Reckoning. Command Sergeant Major Vance didn't come alone. She arrived with Brigadier General Thomas Fitzgerald, the officer who had commanded Caleb's brigade, and who, I would learn that very night, had personally pushed Caleb's valor recommendation through an accelerated review after hearing the full, unfiltered account from the 2 young soldiers Caleb had thrown himself between, and disaster. I found out later that General Fitzgerald had driven 3 hours that afternoon after canceling a scheduled briefing, telling his own staff only that something more important came up. He'd met Caleb years earlier during a training rotation overseas, before either of them held the rank they held now, and had apparently never forgotten a young private who once talked his way through a broken radio repair in the middle of a sandstorm, rather than wait for a replacement part. Command Sergeant Major Vance told me afterward that the general had said, on the drive over, that he owed Caleb this much and more. They walked into that Charleston ballroom the way people walk in when they've decided ahead of time that they belong there, though of course no one had invited them. Preston's work crew had already wheeled in the small grinding tool to smooth the plaque's surface before re-engraving it. Exactly the scene I had dreaded for 2 straight weeks. General Fitzgerald stopped the whole operation with 6 words, and a look that had clearly ended arguments long before this one. Then he turned, unhurried, to face the room full of Kensingtons and their guests. "I'm not here to make a scene," he said, his voice carrying without effort to the back wall. "I'm here because a soldier who served under my command is being quietly written out of his own history by people who don't understand what he actually did. And I will not allow that to happen while I am still breathing." He explained, calmly, and without a shred of theater, that Staff Sergeant Caleb Grayson's Silver Star had been formally approved 11 days earlier, the paperwork simply taking the time it takes to move through a proper review board. He explained that Caleb hadn't merely survived some vague training accident. He had made a conscious, split-second decision to place his own body between a failing rope system and 2 younger soldiers, absorbing an impact that saved both of their lives, in an act the board had classified, in writing, as clear and deliberate gallantry under dangerous conditions. Diane went pale in a way I had genuinely never seen from her before. Preston tried to recover, insisting this was still fundamentally a private family matter, and that military business had no place inside a hotel lobby his own family owned. That's when Command Sergeant Major Vance stepped forward with a folder of her own, thin but precise. She laid out, plainly and without raising her voice once, what federal law actually said about the situation Preston had tried so quietly to engineer. Caleb's service member's group life insurance designation, updated and witnessed the very week Wren was born, legally controlled the payout regardless of any older form the family's attorney had unearthed from a filing cabinet somewhere. Federal SGLI statute doesn't bend to a family's private preference. It answers only to the soldier's own signed intent, documented and dated. She reminded the room, too, that as a fallen soldier's surviving spouse, I held recognized legal standing over memorial and burial decisions that no private family arrangement, however well-funded, could quietly override. Then General Fitzgerald turned his attention back to the plaque itself, still half covered by a drop cloth someone had draped over it minutes earlier. This wall will list Staff Sergeant Caleb Grayson's full rank, his unit, and his award, he said, or it will not have his name on it at all. There is no version of this evening where a decorated soldier gets reduced to a footnote in his own family's hotel lobby. Diane, to her lasting credit, was the first to break. She sat down heavily in a folding chair near the wall, one hand pressed over her mouth, and admitted, quietly, almost to herself rather than to the room, that she had never known about the Silver Star, had never let herself ask enough real questions over the years to understand who her own son had actually become out there. "He never told me any of it," she said, looking up at General Fitzgerald like she was hoping he might contradict her. "I thought he just drove trucks, or did paperwork somewhere overseas. He never wanted to talk about it when he called." "He didn't talk about it because that's who he was, ma'am," Command Sergeant Major Vance answered, not unkindly. "Men like your son don't come home bragging. They come home quiet, and they let the people who actually watched it happen do the talking when the time is right. This is that time." A few relatives near the back of the room had gone still, phones lowered, clearly recalculating everything they thought they understood about the nephew or cousin they'd spent years quietly dismissing at holiday gatherings. One older relative I barely recognized wiped her eyes and murmured to the woman beside her that she wished she'd sent him more than a Christmas card the last few years, a small comment that somehow landed harder than anything the generals had said. Preston wasn't finished digging his own hole just yet. He tried, one last time, to argue that the estate attorney's letter about the insurance still stood regardless of anything the Army had to say about it. That was the exact moment Grace Sullivan, an attorney Vance had quietly brought into the situation weeks earlier, after learning about the beneficiary dispute, stepped forward and mentioned, almost as an aside, almost gently, that while reviewing the estate paperwork on Naomi's behalf, she had happened to notice some irregularities in the hotel group's recent financial filings that Preston personally controlled, irregularities that looked considerably less like clerical error and considerably more like money quietly moving somewhere it was never supposed to go. Preston's face did something in that moment I had genuinely never seen from him before, in all the years I'd known him. He didn't say another word for the remainder of the evening. The room emptied out slowly after that, relatives drifting toward the exits in twos and threes, murmuring to each other in the low tone people use when they've just watched something they'll be discussing for years. A few of them stopped to shake General Fitzgerald's hand on the way out, or to touch the newly uncovered plaque with something like reverence, as though seeing Caleb's real name and rank engraved there had finally made his absence feel like the loss it actually was, rather than the inconvenience the family had quietly treated it as for weeks. Command Sergeant Major Vance stayed behind with me until the staff began stacking chairs, and before she left, she pulled a small velvet box from her jacket pocket and pressed it into my hand. Inside was a spare set of Caleb's dog tags, ones he'd left with his unit years earlier as backup issue. "He'd want Wren to have these someday," she said. "I figured tonight was as good a night as any to make sure they ended up with you instead of a supply closet." ACT 4. After 6 months passed before the full shape of that night finally settled into something resembling peace. Grace Sullivan's discovery, made almost in passing that evening, turned into a formal audit within weeks, and the audit turned into a real state investigation soon after. Preston, it turned out, had been quietly diverting funds from 3 of the family's hotel properties into a private shell account for nearly 2 years, a scheme that unraveled remarkably fast once outside eyes finally started paying attention. He was removed from operational control of Kensington Hospitality Group by the family's own board of directors before the year was out, and by early the following spring, he faced formal fraud charges, with a court eventually ordering restitution north of $400,000. Richard Kensington, humiliated and visibly exhausted by the entire ordeal, sold his controlling stake in the company not long after, choosing quiet retirement over another public scandal. Local business coverage of the sale mentioned the fraud investigation only in a single paragraph near the bottom of the article, but everyone in that family understood exactly what had actually happened and exactly whose name had been the catalyst for finally pulling back the curtain on it. Diane called me for the first time on her own in July. It wasn't a perfect conversation, and I don't think either of us expected it to be. Some wounds don't stitch closed in a single phone call, no matter how much both people want them to. But she asked, tentatively, for the first time in her life, whether she could see photographs of Caleb in uniform. I gathered what I had and sent her a folder that same night. She called back 2 days later, crying, asking why nobody had ever told her sooner about the Silver Star, about the 2 lives he had saved, about any of it. I didn't have a kind answer ready for that question, so I simply let her cry and stayed on the line until she was finished. The remembrance wall in that Charleston lobby was rebuilt within the month. It reads now, in full, exactly as it should have from the very beginning. Staff Sergeant Caleb Grayson, United States Army, Silver Star. Beloved husband, father, and son. Diane requested that final word herself, and I let her have it, because grief needs somewhere to land eventually, and I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to spend whatever years I have left keeping careful score against a grieving mother. I was selected for promotion to major that fall, an outcome I try hard not to connect too directly to everything that happened that spring, though I know Caleb would have made some quiet joke about the timing if he'd been there to see it. My promotion ceremony was small, held in a conference room at Fort Stewart, and I invited exactly 1 member of Caleb's family to attend. Diane came, sat in the back row, and cried through the entire thing, which surprised me less than it once would have. Preston, for his part, sent 1 email through his own lawyer that fall, a stiff, carefully worded apology that read more like a legal disclaimer than an actual reckoning. I didn't respond to it. Some apologies aren't really meant for the person receiving them. They're meant to make a paper trail look better later, and I'd learned enough about paper trails from that family to recognize one when I saw it. Wren is 3 years old now, and she has her father's stubborn chin and his exact habit of going quiet right before she says something surprisingly sharp for her age. Every year, on the anniversary of that first phone call to Command Sergeant Major Vance, we drive together to the training memorial near Fayetteville, and she helps me polish the small brass plate bearing her father's name, the same careful, patient way I once watched him polish his own boots the night before every deployment. She doesn't fully understand yet what the plate means, only that it matters to me, and that seems to be enough for her at 3 years old. Afterward, we drive home, and I read her the last letter he wrote before that final training exercise. The one where he told me, almost offhand, almost like an afterthought, that if anything ever happened to him, he needed her to grow up knowing exactly who her father was. She knows now. So does the rest of his family, whether or not they ever wanted to learn it this particular way. And on nights when the house feels a little too quiet after she's asleep, I take out that small velvet box Command Sergeant Major Vance handed me in that Charleston ballroom, and I hold his dog tags for a minute, and I remind myself that some families are the ones you're born into, and some are the ones that show up when it counts, and I got lucky enough in this life to have both, even if it took a fight to prove it. If this story landed with you the way it landed with me while I was living through it, tell me 1 word in the comments below, just 1, that describes what you felt watching that plaque almost get erased in front of a room full of strangers. Families don't always get to choose who shows up for them when it matters most. Sometimes it's blood, sometimes it's the people who wore the same uniform your loved one wore, and simply refused to stop showing up long after everyone else assumed the job was already finished. And if this story reminded you that love and loyalty don't always come from the direction you'd expect, subscribe. Because tomorrow, I am telling you about a she took my wedding ring at the funeral. Then a Marine Honor Guard arrived looking for me. I'll see you there.